Welcome back, everyone. Today we're bringing you a brand new explainer, and we are unpacking a really highly charged political interview recently broadcast on the Australia Identity Channel. Now, if you follow Australian politics at all, you already know the landscape is shifting incredibly fast right now. So today we're going to take a completely impartial, structured look at the rhetoric, the intense policy debates, and those wild party dynamics playing out between the Liberal Party and One Nation. We're going to cut right through the noise, map out exactly what's driving these political tremors, and look at what it all means for the future of conservative politics down under.
Okay, let's dive into this. To untangle this whole chaotic interview, we're breaking it down into 4 distinct themes. First, we've got a political earthquake, then the net zero contradiction. After that, debating the Paris Agreement, and finally, we'll wrap up with the panel's predictions and fallout.
So, starting off with Section 1, a political earthquake, shifting party loyalties.
To really grasp the tone of this debate, you have to look at how the channel host actually frames the whole situation right out of the gate. The broadcast opens with this super dramatic rhetoric, literally calling recent events a political earthquake. This language, it's designed to immediately establish a really highly partisan framing. They're positioning these recent political maneuvers not just as standard everyday party changes, but as this monumental, foundational shift in the Australian right-wing landscape. It definitely sets the stage for a very combative interview.
Now let's look at the actual facts driving this so-called earthquake. The whole debate centers around 2 specific, very high-level defections from the Liberal Party straight over to One Nation. We've got Holly Hughes, a former Liberal senator representing New South Wales, and Tina McQueen, the former federal vice president of the Liberal Party. I mean, we aren't talking about fringe members or low-level staffers here. These are established, highly influential figures inside the core Liberal Party apparatus. And they made a very public decision to jump ship. When a political organization loses voices with that much internal clout, it naturally sends shockwaves through the party and immediately raises some tough questions about its overall stability. And, well, One Nation is absolutely capitalizing on this. Lee Hansen, the national executive manager for One Nation, features pretty prominently in the interview. She embraces these defections enthusiastically. She uses them to validate her party's position, literally stating that One Nation is the home of real conservatism here in Australia. She's arguing that they aren't just attracting random opportunists, but rather the right talent who share One Nation's vision, which subtly, or maybe not so subtly, implies that the Liberal Party has just completely lost its conservative way.
Moving on to Section 2, the net zero contradiction. Policy versus party.
This brings us to a really fascinating shift. We move away from the party drama and straight into the actual ideological clashes fueling the debate. And it brings up the core contradiction pointed out by the Liberal Party representative in the interview, a guy named Matt. He poses a huge rhetorical hurdle for One Nation. He asks, basically, if One Nation is truly the strict conservative home of Australian politics, like Lee Hansen claims, and if they're fundamentally opposed to net zero emissions targets, then why on earth are they welcoming someone with open arms who strongly supports net zero?
Matt uses this contradiction to go completely on the offensive. He claims that Holly Hughes didn't just leave the Liberal Party out of the blue. According to Matt, she left explicitly because the Liberal Party officially decided to oppose net zero. So he points out this massive logical inconsistency, right? One Nation wants to defeat net zero, yet they're proudly parading a brand new high-profile recruit who allegedly left her old party precisely because she supports it. He uses that specific policy friction to just directly challenge One Nation's conservative credentials. And that perfectly illustrates the exact wedge issue fracturing these alliances: net zero. The whole concept of reaching a balance between greenhouse gases added to the atmosphere and those taken out, it's acting as a huge fault line right now. It is no longer just a policy debate. It's being used as a literal litmus test for party identity. It's causing major internal friction and totally reshaping who aligns with whom in Canberra. It's the central tension pulling everyone apart. All right, Section 3. Debating the Paris Agreement. Symbolism or handbrake. This takes us into probably the most intricate and fascinating part of the source material, where the guests really dissect international climate treaties. In the crosstalk, you see 2 incredibly distinct viewpoints emerge regarding the 2015 Paris Agreement. On one side, Lee Hansen argues for strict ideological consistency. She says, hey, if your party's policy is to scrap net zero, then logically you should just walk away from the Paris Agreement entirely. But then on the other side, Matt takes this much more pragmatic, almost cynical stance. To him, the agreement is basically just a piece of paper.
He argues that staying in it prevents a whole bunch of unnecessary international friction, whereas pulling out offers absolutely no practical benefit at all. Let's actually see how Matt builds this argument, because he breaks his defense down into 3 specific steps. He argues the Paris Agreement doesn't actually force any country to adopt net zero. According to him, the only real tangible obligations are, number 1, set an emissions target. And he notes that target will simply be in line with the rest of the world, not necessarily zero. Number 2, report against that target, which he claims Australia has been doing easily since the late 90s anyway. And number 3, take measures to encourage corporate efficiency, which he points out is just good business practice regardless. To really hammer home his point that the treaty is largely toothless when it comes to strict bans, Matt details the specific actions that are actually still completely permissible. He points out that other signatory nations, he specifically calls out China and Indonesia during the interview, are actively building coal-fired power stations and developing oil fields right now. Therefore, Matt argues, Australia can totally remain in the Paris Agreement and still heavily invest in fossil fuels like coal and oil without ever violating the formal terms of the treaty. So the crucial takeaway here is captured perfectly in this quote from Matt. He's framing his position entirely around pure national interest. To him, ripping up an international agreement for purely symbolic reasons, just to prove how conservative you are, it's foolish if it causes diplomatic angst, but doesn't actually yield any tangible domestic benefits. He wants to remove what he calls the handbrake of net zero for sure, but he sees zero reason to burn international bridges over the Paris Agreement to get it done. It's pragmatism over ideology, plain and simple. And that brings us to Section 4, Predictions and Fallout, Looking Ahead. Let's transition to the final segment of the video, where the host asks the guests to just make some bold speculations about the future. As the interview wraps up, we get this rather eclectic timeline of predictions, pretty much exactly as they flowed in the broadcast. Starting on a lighter note, Lee proudly predicts that her son, who apparently just won his footy game, will do even better next season. It's a nice, relatable mom moment right in the middle of this heavy political debate. But then, pivoting sharply to global politics, Lee boldly predicts that within a week, Keir Starmer, who she actually refers to as Karma, will no longer be the Prime Minister in London. And finally, looking at domestic policy, Matt predicts that the current Labour Party government will soon start completely backing down on their proposed tax changes. So yeah, it's a very rapid-fire end to an intense discussion. Finally, the YouTube channel hosts comes back in to deliver their closing monologue. They wrap up the whole narrative by bringing it right back to their core premise, framing the Liberal Party as currently suffering from a massive identity crisis. The host concludes that these high-profile defections are happening because, quote-unquote, real conservatives are just exhausted by a Liberal Party that they perceive as constantly drifting to the political left while pretending to stay rooted. Which leaves us with this final, genuinely provocative thought. We've mapped out the defections, the net zero contradictions, and those deep diplomatic debates over the Paris Agreement. But the ultimate question for you, as we watch all this unfold, is this. How will these internal conservative fractures, which are clearly driven by very real, very complex policy disputes, how will they ultimately reshape the entire Australian political landscape? Will the tremor settle down, or is this just the very beginning of the earthquake? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and we'll catch you next time.